Hello, I'm Dennis Martin, president of the St. Louis Audubon Society, and I'm really excited to be here tonight to introduce St. Louis County Library's video conversation between renowned author and illustrator David Allen Sibley and Washington University Arts and Science professor Jonathan Losos. I know I speak on behalf of St. Louis Audubon, but also birders everywhere when I say that David Sibley is among our most recognized names. My tattered copy of his field guide for the birds of Eastern North America is a testament to the importance of the learning tools that he's provided to birders everywhere, and it's an invaluable resource to have with you in the field when you're out looking for birds. His work has been a great learning tool. His new book, What It's Like to Be a Bird, is a great compilation of illustrations and essays, and it's just a great little addition to your coffee table, to your studies and libraries, and to your living rooms. And I highly recommend it as a teaching tool, again, about birds and nature. And it's a wonderful, wonderful work. We're fortunate to have another terrific scholar with us tonight, author and teacher and researcher, Jonathan Losos, who is the William H. Danforth Distinguished Professor in Arts and Sciences at Washington University, the place where he started his career as a brilliant young biologist before moving on to Harvard University. Washington University in St. Louis were very fortunate to recruit him back home in 2018. In partnership with the Missouri Botanical Gardens and the St. Louis Zoo, Jonathan leads the Living Earth Collaborative, an academic center dedicated to advancing the study of biodiversity. So we're lucky to have these two researchers, authors, and teachers with us tonight for what I know is going to be a fascinating and engaging conversation on birds, biodiversity, evolution, and the wonders of nature. On behalf of St. Louis Audubon, I want to thank the St. Louis County Libraries, our partner in so many important activities and programs, joint programs that we run together. The county libraries are really a great regional treasure, and thanks to them for making this happen. Thanks also to HEC for their production expertise in making this conversation widely available in a high quality format while we continue to work our way through the pandemic and the limitations of large group settings. David Sibley's What It's Like to Be a Bird is available at Left Bank Books. There are signed book plates available for this or any other of David Sibley's books that you can get when you purchase at Left Bank Books. I recommend his book for birders of all skill levels and ages, for anyone looking to bring a little bit of nature home to their living rooms, as I said, studies or coffee tables with beautiful illustrations and very interesting short essays. Visit St. Louis Audubon at stlouisaudubon.org. You can learn more about the work that we're doing, the events we have scheduled, and how you can participate. But for now, sit back and enjoy a lively conversation between David Allen Sibley and Jonathan Losos.
Many thanks, Dennis. I'm Jonathan Losos, professor of biology at Washington University and author of Improbable Destinies. I'm delighted to have a chance to talk today with David Sibley, whose recent book, What It's Like to Be a Bird, came out last year. David, it's a real pleasure to meet you. I've been a fan ever since you published the Sibley Guide to Birds in 2000. Since then, you've written a half dozen additional books on birds. So my first question to you is, why did you decide to write another book on birds? And how is this one different from your previous books?
Yeah, hi, Jonathan. It's great to meet you and a pleasure to be talking with you. This book, there's an endless amount of things that could be written and illustrated about birds. I'm learning new things all the time, as you know, in your field. There's so much new information coming out all the time, and it's so fascinating, the things that are being learned. But this book, it started out as an idea for a children's book. I wanted to do a book about birds for kids, and I wanted it to be a little bit more than just a field guide, to introduce the birds and some of their superpowers. Birds are so amazing. They do such amazing things. And as I started researching those sort of fun facts and putting that information in, that became so engrossing to me. I was learning so much. Even after 50 years of studying birds, I was learning so much and relearning so much that I thought I knew. that those short essays then became the entire book. So this book it turned into more of a what birds are capable of and what they're doing and why. And along the way, introducing most of the most familiar species across North America. So in that sense, it could work as an identification guide. Just as people page through the book, they'll see pictures of nuthatches and jays and Canada goose and the familiar species. So they'll learn the names of those birds. But it became much more of a sort of science celebration of birds, and still geared towards kids, but sort of for any age.
Well, great. I'd like to come back to talk about the book in a moment, but I'd like to digress and talk a little bit about you and your history. You have been called the Roger Tory Peterson of our times and compared to John James Audubon. You've won numerous awards and your books have sold nearly 2 million copies. Yet your first book, The Sibley Guide to Birds, wasn't published until the year 2000 when you were in your late 30s. So my question is, what were you doing all that time before writing the book? Or more specifically, how did the trajectory of the first nearly 40 years of your life lead you to write that first book and become one of the world's authorities on birds?
Yeah, so my father's an ornithologist, so that's a key key point. So I grew up with birds, with bird books in the house. When we went on a family picnic on the weekends, it was usually with some of my father's colleagues and friends, and birds were a topic of discussion. And I liked birds myself, and I loved drawing. And from my very early age, 5, 7 years old, I liked drawing birds. And of course, with my father and his friends, I got lots of encouragement and lots of opportunities to study birds, to band birds, to hold them in my hand, to see a lot of different species and learn a lot about them. So the more I learned, the more interesting it became. And I did meet Roger Tory Peterson. We moved to Connecticut when I was in 4th grade, and he lived just 20 miles away. I met him a few times when I was a kid, and he was very encouraging. And I look back at all that now and think, with an ornithologist for a father, going birding every weekend, meeting Roger Tory Peterson when I was 12 years old, to me, the idea of writing a field guide seemed like a normal career path. And I spent those years, 30, the years leading up to the publication of the book, just traveling around the country, sketching, studying, learning, gathering all the information that went into the book.
Well, that's impressive. So let's get to your most recent book, What It's Like to Be a Bird. The book, which is wonderful, is divided into 2 primary sections, a 23-page introduction to bird biology, and then a series of 87 essays, each featuring a large painting and discussing in total 96 species. Your entry on roadrunners. Now, I have to say, that made me a little sad because I'm a lizard guy. That's what I do for a living. I study lizards, and the roadrunner is eating a lizard. But I understand that's the way things go. Anyway, your roadrunner entry was a way for you to talk about the evolution of birds from dinosaurs. And so I really enjoyed going through your essays because it was a little bit like opening Christmas presents. I would turn to the next page and see that the next entry featured, for example, the northern cardinal, but I never knew what topic you were going to talk about with respect to cardinals. Would it be nest building or molting or circadian cycles? And so that was always very interesting for me to see, what's coming next. So my question is, how did you pick which species and which topics? Did you have a list of topics and then find the species that would illustrate them? Or did you start with the species and then say, what can I say about a cardinal? Or some combination of those two?
Yeah, that was a combination. I started out, one of my goals in the book was to try to answer the most common questions that I hear from birders and non-birders. And really, was focusing on my non-birding friends and neighbors, the questions that they ask about birds. And those are some of the most interesting ones to research. And so I kept a list of questions, a list of topics, and I kept adding to that. And as I came up with the list of questions, I also tried to cover the whole breadth of ornithology. And there's a lot of topics I obviously didn't get to, but I wanted to cover a wide range and give sort of equal time to anatomy, evolution, behavior, appearance. So yeah, it was a challenge, and just sort of patchwork of fitting. About half the essay is probably attached naturally to one species or one page, and then the rest I kind of mixed and matched.
So you wrote in the book, one of the themes that impressed me throughout my work on this book is that a bird's experience is far richer, more complex, and more thoughtful than I'd imagined. I was wondering if you could share a couple of your favorite examples illustrating this point.
You know, they're seeing a lot more than we do. They're hearing more than we do. One of my favorite examples of just their enhanced senses. There's research on red knots, a kind of sandpiper, that all the sandpipers have very sensitive touch sensors in the tip of their bill, and also they can taste. They have some taste buds near the tip of their bill. So when a sandpiper picks something up with the tip of its bill, it's already feeling it and tasting it before it goes any farther. But the most amazing thing I learned was that these red knots, when they stick their bill down into the mud or wet sand, the water that's there in the sand or mud is displaced. When the bird sticks its bill in, the water has to move away. And if the water is blocked from moving in some direction by something impervious like a clam or a rock, slightly higher pressure builds up there as the water is squeezed between the bird's bill and the impervious object, and the birds can sense that. They're so sensitive to pressure, they can tell when they've put their bill in close to something that might be interesting to them, like a small clam. So they're not just blindly jabbing their bill down into the mud. They're getting a whole sort of mental picture, a sensory picture of what's down there. So, and then at the same time, they're using their eyes. They're finding food by the sense of touch and smell and taste, using their eyes to scan around them and seeing 360 degrees around all the time. So it's just the idea that they're getting and processing all that information, and they're perfectly adapted for what they're doing.
Speaking about me for a minute, my research on lizards, one of the things I often go out and do is take binoculars and just watch them to see what their behavior is like. And what I find is that after I've watched a lizard for a while, and now having done it for many, many years, I think I can put myself into the head of that lizard, to think like a lizard, that as I'm watching it, I have a sense of what that lizard's thinking about, what the issues are, why it's deciding to do what it does. Now, when I look at birds, I don't have that feeling, but I'm guessing that you do. So I'm questioning, do you think you can think like a bird? And more generally, how would you tell your readers what they can do so they can learn to think like a bird?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. And I can anticipate what a bird is going to do. I can kind of read the signs of its behavior, its attitude, its posture, its sounds, and have a sense that, oh, it's about to fly, it's really relaxed, all those kinds of senses. So I think that kind of observation is so important to discovery. So I congratulate you on that.
Thank you.
I have a lot of respect for people who take the time to do that, because I think that's where a lot of discoveries come from, is just sort of hours of watching, and gradually, very gradually, you notice things. So that's what I would encourage people to do, is just sit and watch birds. I'll go back to your previous question about my comment that birds' lives are so much richer than I had ever imagined, and that watching birds in that way, and then all the research for this book made me realize just how much information the birds are taking in, and the kinds of decisions that they're making all the time. They're not, automatons running on instinct. They're taking in information about the angle of light, the temperature, other birds that are in the area, other sounds they're hearing, the food they found that morning, how much food they still need, whether they need water, where they're going to find that. They respond to all of these inputs and sort of analyze it all and make very subtle decisions about what they're going to do.
In that light, following on what you just said, you wrote in the book that, quote, instinct must motivate a bird by feelings of satisfaction, anxiety, pride, etc. I realize this is enormously anthropomorphic, you write, but how else do we explain the complex decisions that birds make every day, balancing competing needs, such as finding food, while minimizing effort and risk? You addressed this a little bit, but could you elaborate further on what you mean about birds having feelings like anxiety and pride?
Yeah, and I know that the danger in that is suggesting that they have feelings that are analogous to ours, or that are similar to ours, and their brains are different, their experience is different. So, say a bird's getting ready to build a nest, instinct is telling it that the lengthening days trigger hormones, which trigger the impetus to build a nest, to start the breeding process. So a bird is sort of instinctively driven to build a nest, but then they're making decisions about exactly where, exactly when, with whom. I just have a sense that there's a connection, that the way birds feel about building nests, and the way they, the feeling that they get when a predator shows up and they dash for cover, it looks like fear, anxiety, and I don't think there's any reason to shy away from making a connection between the feeling that the birds have, or the motivation that is making the birds act that way, and the motivation that we feel when we see something scary.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I think scientists have been, in general, we're told to be dispassionate, not to be speculative, but yet these instincts, these feelings we have are there for a reason. And why shouldn't the same thing occur in birds or lizards or whatever?
Yeah,
I'm on your side for sure on this one. So David, from this conversation, it sounds like birds are pretty smart. What do you say to people who use the expression bird brain?
Yeah, I address that directly in the book. There's a lot of expressions that sort of disparage birds' intelligence. Dodo, silly goose, bird brain. But birds are incredibly smart, and their brain, they have small brains, small heads, but their brain structure, the architecture of their brain is different from ours. So they pack a lot more neurons into the same amount of space. And they do so many things so well. And so, for example, chickadees and some jays can remember tens of thousands of locations where they've hidden food. And not just the location, but the quality of the food that's stored there, and whether that food is perishable or not. So whether they should retrieve it within days or if it can last for months. And pigeons understand the difference between a drop of water, a puddle of water, a lake. Pigeons have been trained in the lab to distinguish impressionist art from other kinds of art. And they're actually, with a little bit of training, they are as good at reading mammograms as trained technicians. They can spot a tumor in a mammogram as well as a human can with a little bit of training. They're geared for pattern recognition, those kinds of things, and they're very smart. So yeah, those expressions are not really they're not as much of an insult as you might think.
I'm going to change subjects now. It's nice to hear that not all news about the environment is bad. You note that both the Canada goose and the turkey were rare a century ago and now are abundant. Similarly, the brown pelican was an endangered species due to DDT poisoning, but now has recovered. And plus, some species like robins, barn swallows, and cardinals are thriving around human areas. Yet, on the whole, bird populations are declining. Could you discuss the causes of the bird situation, pro and con, and what concerned citizens can do?
Yeah, so I think the lesson from those the success stories of conservation is that if we give birds a safe space to do their thing, they will be just fine. So brown pelican and osprey and bald eagle were and many other species were decimated by DDT in the 50s and 60s. And as soon as DDT was banned, those populations started to recover, and they've done very well. And while turkey and Canada goose were their populations were extremely low because of overhunting, and without being, it's been a lot of effort with Canada goose to reintroduce them, and tremendously successful. Putting Canada geese back into places where they were historically. And with less hunting pressure and a lot of sanctuaries, national wildlife refuges, places where they can find food and shelter and be safe, they have done incredibly well. And what's threatening birds today is it's a complex range of things. Climate change is a big one that will affect all species, some more than others. And some species are affected by the pesticides that are still being used. Habitat loss is one of the biggest factors in bird population changes. And here in the Northeast, in New England, where I live, there was a lot more farmland 50, 75 years ago. A lot of that farmland has now grown up into forest. So forest birds are doing fairly well. Pileated woodpecker, golden-crowned kinglet, species like that are doing quite well. Grassland species like bobolink, eastern meadowlark, and shrubland species like field sparrow and brown thrasher and eastern towhee are declining here. And that's all, you can point to habitat for that. So I think for what people can do is do as much as you can, make your own yard and neighborhood a safe place for birds.
So move to a different question. You're going full steam ahead right now, publishing one book after the next, it seems. But eventually the time will come to hand the mantle of top ornithologist off to someone else. What would you say to the 7-year-old girls or boys who want to be the next David Sibley? And what would you say to their parents?
There's always more to learn. There are new ways to look at things. There's new media to explore, new ways of presenting information in apps and digitally. And there's an endless amount to be learned. There is no end to what can be learned. And if you have a passion for this and a vision for sharing that information with people, there will always be a place in the world, a market for illustration. Keep drawing, because illustration and the process of drawing and converting that information into an illustration is so important, and it can't be matched by any technological breakthrough that is even on the horizon. There is no substitute for a real person taking in all the information, summarizing it, and creating a drawing.
Well, speaking of the child who will become the next David Sibley, I may actually know him. Allison Miller and Jason Knopf are both fabulous biology professors here at St. Louis University, but it turns out that the biological genius in their family may be in the next generation. 11-year-old Henry Knopf has long been an avid naturalist, but recently he's become obsessed with birds and walks around all the time with his tattered copy of the Sibley Guide. Just yesterday, he added the blue-gray gnatcatcher to his life list. Henry already plans to go to Cornell University so that he can study at their famous Laboratory of Ornithology. So Henry was very disappointed to learn that your appearance here would only be virtual, because he wanted to meet you in person and ask you some questions. And so I've decided to give Henry the last question today. You've actually answered it maybe a little bit, but Henry wanted to know, when songbirds are perched on a branch and flick their tails, do they do this to keep their balance or for some other purpose?
Well, Henry, I'm really glad to know that you're there, and someday after this pandemic is over, I hope that we get a chance to meet and do a little birding together. And yeah, as I said a little bit earlier about phoebes, when birds flick their tails for some different reasons. Sometimes it's just to keep their balance, but that's usually like if a bird lands, say it lands on a twig and the twig sways and the bird kind of moves its tail in time with the way the twig is swaying, that would be keeping its balance. Mostly when birds flick their tails, I think it's for this sort of signaling their alertness, signaling their health. And there is one other thing, a gnatcatcher, which, as you mentioned, is you just saw your first gnatcatcher, which is a fantastic bird, so dynamic, it's so tiny. But what they do, flicking their tails, they raise their tail up and fan it and kind of flick it back and forth, and that, I think, is probably to scare insects. So, and I mentioned that in What It's Like to Be a Bird in terms of mockingbirds lifting their wings and showing their big white wing flashes. And they do that as they're hopping around on the lawn. And the thought is that it's taking advantage of a really fundamental instinctive response, which again, we share with birds. So we blink, we flinch when something comes at us very quickly, when something big suddenly appears in front of us. And so what the mockingbirds are doing, and maybe what the gnatcatchers are doing as they flick their tail up and wave it around, and it has big white patches in it, they may be hoping that an insect that's sitting nearby will flinch, will burst out of its hiding place and try to get away, or will just move slightly to try to get more hidden. And when it moves, the birds will notice it. So yes, 3 different ways that birds might flick their tails. But gnatcatchers, I think it's probably mostly to scare insects out of hiding. And then imagine hopping along a twig and an insect that was hiding 6 inches away from you suddenly takes flight, and you're quick enough to take off from that perch and fly out a foot or two, chase that insect down and catch it in midair, and then fly back to the branch. And that's what gnatcatchers are doing. In like 1 second, they scare an insect, they fly after it, grab it out of the air, and fly back to the perch and keep foraging.
So many thanks, David, for this stimulating discussion and for writing such a great book. Thanks too to the St. Louis County Library and the St. Louis chapter of the Audubon Society for arranging this conversation, and to Left Bank Books, which partners with the library to help put on these events. I should add that Left Bank Books will have signed book plates for any copies of David's books purchased through them. So thanks to all of you for watching, and thanks again, David.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.